This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Ann Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Ann Pratt. I'm formerly from South Africa, and I relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative Fellowship in beautiful Boston in the United States of America. Today, our thoughtful bold leader joins us from Cambridge, a suburb of the beautiful Boston greater metropolitan area. In 2024, the International Corporate Governance Network awarded him the Lifetime Achievement Award. He is an architect of international corporate governance and directed the Yale School of Management's Milstein Center for Corporate Governance and Performance. He galvanizes global markets to invest responsibly and promotes an international financial system that delivers profits and protects our planet and its people. He serves on the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission Investment Advisory Committee, is chair of Hermes EOS, advising asset managers managing trillions of US dollars on investor stewardship, and is a Harvard Law School senior fellow. He has co-authored 3 books. The first, The New Capitalists. The second, What They Do With Your Money. And thirdly, Apartheid's Rebels, Inside South Africa's Hidden War, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. Stay with us as he takes us into his mind and wisdom on why investment chiefs and asset managers must speak out. Leviticus, the 3rd book of the Torah, and what makes leaders like Mandela, Zelensky, and Alexei Navalny, whom he knew personally at Yale, remarkable and relevant. We warmly welcome a wise and good friend, Dr. Stephen Davis, and welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future. Stephen, it's so wonderful to be back with you again. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation and being with us today.
Well, I'm completely honored to be asked and delighted to join you.
I thought an interesting place to begin. You have a remarkable international range of experiences. You've committed your life and purpose and passion to doing a lot of work in corporate governance in the world. And I wondered, where did you begin? What kind of inspired you to move into the area of law, diplomacy, and good governance?
Yeah, it's a good question because, many people, especially, maybe sometimes our children think, oh, their parents have everything planned out. And this was not planned at all. In fact, it sort of happened because of a bit of a crisis or a challenge in my own sort of trajectory. I had a set of expectations. I went to graduate school in public policy, and my intention had been to go into public service, into government, probably foreign policy, State Department in the United States. And I worked for a campaign in 1988 for Governor Michael Dukakis, governor at the time of Massachusetts, who was the Democratic nominee for U.S. president. And my job was to run Africa policy for that campaign because my background really in graduate school had been on international relations and in particular focus on South Africa. So for that campaign, that's what my job was. And kind of my assumption was I'd follow that through. Well, you'll probably recall that Governor Dukakis did not actually become president of the United States. It was George H.W. Bush, who won that election. And for me, that was a big disappointment, not just the election, but the whole notion that the United States would be going in a very different direction than I felt was right, including on Africa. So I was casting about thinking, what am I going to do with my life? And I was working at the time for a nonprofit think tank in Washington that focused on South Africa. I went to a conference at Columbia University in New York on corporate governance, which was a field that I was kind of aware of, but I didn't know very much about it. It struck me as kind of boring, a lot of nuts and bolts about
Yeah.
corporations. But I listened to a speech by someone who later became a good friend, Jonathan Charkham, who at the time was with the Bank of England. And he
Yeah.
gave this speech about corporate governance. And to me, it was an epiphany because he wasn't talking about nuts and bolts. He was talking about corporate governance as something that was kind of akin to public policy, almost akin to politics. So I could understand it. It was about corporate responsibility, the corporation's role in the world. And to me, the epiphany was beyond actually what Jonathan Charkham was talking about. I suddenly, what opened up to me was this sort of notion that there was not just civil society, but a civil economy. The
Yes.
parallel set of ideas where companies play a role in the world, where I could not just help change the world as I had hoped to through public policy, but
Yeah.
also through mobilizing capital, trying to get capital behind responsible policies in different parts of the world. And
And
so
when
that,
you talk about capital, you're talking about financial capital as opposed to social capital.
yeah,
Or what?
exactly. Yeah. The capital that is assembled with all of us who, have the fortune of setting aside any kind of savings, whether it's
Yeah.
for retirement or healthcare or whatever it is. And we set money aside and, all of that money accumulates to a vast amount, and it is managed by huge institutional investors.
Yeah.
And it suddenly occurred to me that capital was divorced up until that moment, 1988, from social policy, with a
Yeah.
few exceptions, South Africa being one of them.
Yeah.
But for the most part, capital was not involved with values, social responsibility. And it suddenly occurred to me, wait a minute, corporations can be democratic. In fact, the whole theory of the corporation for a public company is that there's shareholder democracy. But it
Yeah.
wasn't working. There was
Yeah.
no real democracy. It was on paper, and that's all. And so it struck me, here is a life course that I could embrace. And, it has, it not only took over my life, but here we are all these years later, and
Yeah.
it is now the guiding force of economic thought that corporations have a role to play in society, an enormous path. But I feel like I helped sort of envisage that and move things in this direction.
Yeah, that's great, Stephen. It's a wonderful segue. I mean, I know you're also associate director at Harvard Law School of their program on corporate governance. I think, if I recall correctly, you've also consulted to Her Majesty's Treasury in the United Kingdom and Euronext, a European big stock exchange of traded assets, and even the World Economic Forum. So from that moment at Columbia University to where you are today, whether it be at Harvard or World Economic Forum, how would you define corporate governance today, and how has it changed?
Well, it's changed enormously. If I think about when I first started Jonathan Charkham's speech in 1988, just to illustrate the democracy that was supposed to but did not exist, and just look at the United States. There were annual meetings of shareholders to elect
Yeah.
boards of directors. That's what was on paper. But in fact, there were no real elections. It was kind of a Soviet style system where it was routine, it was considered routine that shareholders always vote in favor of the directors. It doesn't matter how troubled the company was. It didn't matter
Yeah.
when there was a company doing bad things socially or whatever. It simply was not a part of the story. Look at the UK, similar story where you could vote, let's say, but at the time of the meeting, it was simply by a show of hands. And if you had voted
Yeah.
by proxy, as most people would do, they simply were not counted as votes. And similarly, I went to Europe, and I remember going to a bank in the Netherlands, and I said, well, you have the responsibility of voting shares at public companies in the Netherlands. What happens if one of your clients wants you to vote no? And they said, oh, well, we don't do that. We won't do that. We simply
Yeah.
won't do it. So there was no democracy. There was no accountability. Boards were kind of for show. Managers were really in charge, or principal shareholders were mainly in
Yeah.
charge. So we didn't really have accountability. Now, if you look back at the history of corporate governance 400 years ago, the very first company to go on a public market was the Dutch East India Company. In 1602, it went on the market. Within a few years, there were Dutch people that were boycotting the shares of the Dutch East India Company because it was engaged in war and pillage and rape and destruction in pursuit of profit in the South Pacific. So in other words, the whole idea of corporate social responsibility was hardwired into corporate governance from the very start of the capital market 400 years ago, more than 400 years ago.
That's remarkable. So if you look at it today, how would you define it today, Stephen?
Today, we are talking a very different story.
Yeah.
Even a few years ago, companies would not touch political, social issues with a barge pole. Today, every day, companies are being asked to weigh in, whether it is on Russia. Should companies be involved in Russia? Should they be involved in companies that are involved with fossil fuels? So there's a big issue around that. Companies, should they be involved in issues in the United States around democracy and the right to vote? These are all issues that now companies are expected to talk about. And companies aren't really quite ready for it in many cases. Boards aren't ready for it. They're not comfortable with it. Our business schools don't teach that, or at least they haven't until recently. CEOs aren't really trained, and they weren't hired to weigh in on public policy. So there's a big transition moment that we're in right now. But we're seeing where the future is, and that is where companies are really part of society. They're not separate from it. They're not ring fenced from values and from social problems.
So do you have an example you could share with us of an organization that was stuck in an old way of thinking around what their duties and responsibilities were and had an epiphany like you did back then? Is there an example of an organization like that? And how did they pivot? How did they transform?
Well, I could think of, the capital market is kind of divided. You've got the corporate side and you've got the investor side. So thinking about, let's say, an example on the corporate side and then one on the investor side. On the corporate side, I'd probably cite Unilever as an example of a large multinational company that was doing pretty much, the usual sort of business as usual, not particularly focused on climate change or environmental or diversity issues and workforce issues. And then Paul Pullman came in as CEO. And he completely changed. He sort of yanked Unilever into what is now kind of a more common practice. And Unilever became a leader and a spokes person or a spokes company,
Yeah.
an example really of it's not
Mhm.
perfect, but it has really showed that companies can be socially responsible and make money. And Unilever does make money.
Sure.
Some companies have to be yanked into it. That was a case where, Paul, it was an insider transition. There are other companies like ExxonMobil where they've had to be yanked into it by outsiders. On the investor side, I think of, let's say, Legal and General, which is now it's LGIM, Legal and General Investment Management
Yeah.
in the UK, one of the large investment managers. And, I used to be on a board of a company in Britain that helped those institutions. And Legal and General used to be a standard issue investor who, as I mentioned earlier, they would just automatically vote yes on every board election and never raise their voice on anything. Well, that changed entirely. LGIM now is one of the thought leaders, one of the on climate change, on diversity. It's breaking ground in many different ways and showing, along with others now too, but where the future voice of capital must lie, which is to really think about the values as well as value.
Yeah. And in your thoughts, I mean, given your experience and your global experience and your mind and thought and experience, what do you think the current state is in the world? How moral and ethical are our corporate organizations? I know that's a very big question, but your general sense of the current state and status of ethics and morality in business.
No, it's a great question. And there are occasions, and Unilever would be one, where the company changes because of the vision, the ethical vision of a leader, of a CEO. But there are many other cases, and I think actually this is the more sustainable uh, way forward, where the institution, whether it's an investor or a company, is moving because they feel like that they must do it because their stakeholders, their constituents, it could be consumers, it could be shareholders, they are demanding and expecting that the institution move in this direction. So, just to cite an example, BlackRock is one of the largest institutional investors, trillions of dollars under management. And, when I first got in the field, BlackRock would have never touched issues like, let's say, climate change or diversity issues or any sort of so-called social issue with a barge pole. But why are they changing? And they are changing. Right now, Larry Fink,
Sure.
who's the CEO, annually releases a statement, and you read these statements and you think, this is exactly right. This is where the world needs to go. It
Yeah.
is because they understand that there is a rising generation of young people
Mhm.
who are saving, who have retirement savings if they're lucky to have jobs and with
Yeah.
benefits such as that. And they're accumulating more and more capital. They are the future of the capital market, and they are the future of BlackRock and State Street. If BlackRock and State Street don't align themselves with the expectations of those grassroots savers like you and me,
Yeah.
then they go out of business or they lose business. So they understand. And if you look at that rising millennial class of investors and savers, they have very different expectations of their financial agents. They want their financial agents to play a role in social issues. They expect that. And so that's why groups like BlackRock are doing it. And that's the more sustainable thing, rather than having, a CEO parachute in and say, I want the company to do this or that.
Yeah, and perhaps times it's, the combination is more powerful because one also needs a chief executive that's going to fulfill the mandate of a board. And if a board is going to say we need to move in a different direction, it's also important one has the right chief executive officer.
You need leadership at the top. And by the way, not just CEOs, but in public companies, you need boards or chairs of the board who also see where the writing on the wall is. And this is where our capital market's not so facile because, boards generally are filled with people who have had past achievements and they understand maybe the world of the past better than they do the future. We have lots of surveys showing, for example, that board members aren't so comfortable. This is changing, but we need to have leadership that is, you're right, attuned with not just where things are now, but where things are likely to go, and to be able to assemble all the ways in which to bring all that to fruition. Yeah.
Stephen, it raises such a good point. When I think about it, is it a question of companies wanting to or have to? So when I listen to you, it sounds like there's a big have to and that there's a compelling business case for these companies to transform. Could you share an example where perhaps a company not only knows they have to, but they want to? And is there a distinct difference in what defines that kind of company? And do they do better in the marketplace?
I think what defines a company that does better is a company that has eyesight and insight on change. And, again, the surveys are beginning to show us, let's say, what a board might look like that has that kind of insight. And what that board looks like is a diverse board. It's not a monoculture. And in my experience, the companies that go wrong or that can't keep up with change are those that are monocultures at the top. You have too many cases where companies have, let's say, they're multinational. They have multi-ethnic workforces. They have multinational and multi-ethnic and multiracial consumer bases. And yet at the top of the company, it's a monoculture of
Sure.
in some cases, like Facebook used to be. You look at Facebook or Meta now, their biggest markets were India and Brazil, not the United States, although the US was the largest. And the board was entirely United States. So you sort of think, well, no wonder Facebook has made lots of missteps. Obviously, it's not the only reason, but where a company is going to be more attuned to the future is when it has a diversity of thought at the top, and including the idea of a CEO who's got eyesight on the present and the future, not just someone who's got a track record of the past.
Yeah, and if you had to paint a picture for us of the future, if we had to project, take us to 2030, 2050, what do you think those companies' role in society will be at that point in time? And what would they have to do to get there?
Yeah, I think companies are going to be part of society. They're not going to be separate from society, which is how they've tried to position themselves for now many decades. They would say, look, our job is to pursue profit, and that's pretty much our main job. But in the future, it's going to be much more integrated. Success, sort of measurements of success are going to include not just profit, but also how companies achieve trust in society. And trust is something different. By the way, in a measurement of trust or the constituents of trust changes over time. It might have been that at some point people thought they would trust a company if, in fact, it just had the job of producing profit. But today, trust in a company, and tomorrow, trust in a company even more so, will depend on whether the company is genuine, whether it projects a sense of care for a workforce, care for the environment, care for respect for consumers, information that it produces in the market. All of those items relate to trust, and that's really what is going to make for a company's success in the future. And again, we haven't in the past really focused on that in our business training. Our business training tends to focus on, how do you manage this and that, but not necessarily how do you gain the trust of stakeholders? How do you communicate? Who are your stakeholders? And how best can you communicate with them? So these are all leadership is going to rest much more on very different sort of meaning definitions of trust going forward.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, in your words, how would you define corporate governance and good corporate governance?
Well, to me, what I focus on, first of all, is the procedures. So do we have accountability? Are there mechanisms of accountability that are functional, that are effective? So for years, and this is a complex question because it's not simply a matter of whether a public company's management is accountable to the board. And that's a kind of a simple question. It's, is there a board that's on top of the company and making hiring and firing decisions? That's only one aspect. But it's how is the board constituted? Is it constituted in a way that engenders trust from stakeholders? Mm-hmm. Does it have an eyesight on the future and the present, not just the past? Does it have a diversity of viewpoint? Is it a monoculture or not? And then beyond that, is there accountability of the board of directors to the institutional investors who tend to vote most of those shares? And then beyond that, and this is the piece where we really need to do a lot more work, is the institutional investor who holds that vote accountable to all of the mass of citizen investors, ordinary people, you and me, who entrust our savings to those institutions and to speak on our behalf when they invest? And we've done lots of work in the past decades to improve boards. That's great. We've also done a lot of work to improve how boards are accountable to shareholders. We do now have a proper vote, for example, in jurisdictions to vote in directors. But we still have lots of work to do to make sure that the governance of institutional investors is transparent, that it is accountable and it's responsible. And we're just beginning to see that era start, where there's greater transparency, where people can begin to see what their agents are doing on their behalf. And there are now bodies that are arising in the market that give eyesight on institutions. And when they fail, when they don't measure up, they're now exposed. That's going to happen much more. And they're not used to it. Companies have become kind of used to getting the spotlight. Institutional investors, not so much. But that's changing.
So, you raise an interesting point and question, Stephen. Quite often we read about, or, having come from our own background in executive search and worked with numerous boards, in multiple sectors, quite often you see if something has gone wrong with the chief executive and they've been let go, there are these confidentiality agreements and big golden handshakes. Do we have an accountability crisis in the corporate sector? And if so, what should organizations be doing differently to lead this new path into the future?
Well, this is where a new phenomenon has arisen to kind of counteract that. And I would argue we're at the very beginning of it, but it's called stewardship, investor stewardship.
Hmm.
So when companies do a stitch up like that, especially one that's out of the public eye, it's really up to the big institutional investors that have the resources to invest, to sort of ask the right questions of boards and try to probe whether boards are making the right decisions on behalf of their owners. That's, you and me, and customers and consumers and all the stakeholders that exist, communities, companies. So stewardship is the solution to this. But we're just beginning to make stewardship real. Uh, the institutional investors have doubled the number of people that are now trained to act as stewardship professionals. And by that, stewardship professionals, I mean people that are the ones who, on behalf of the BlackRocks and the Vanguards and the State Streets, engage with boards and ask the questions and put forward their expectations of companies.
Yeah.
So stewardship used to be something that we didn't even use the word, but it was really a compliance exercise. The institutions were just checking, well, did the boards check the legal boxes?
It was a tick box kind of
tick box exercise? And otherwise, vote yes for everything. Lord Miners in the UK, who was city minister under the last Labour government, kind of famously called these people years ago the open-toed sandal brigade operating in the basements of institutional investors. In other words, they had no power. They were just, making a little noise, and they weren't treated seriously. So today, this is very different. Stewardship now is considered a central part of an investor's profile and their work. It's not just about trading stock back and forth. It's about once you own a share, and if you're for the long term, then you engage with companies. You check whether they're doing secret deals. You try to ask those questions. And if boards are abetting bad practices, then you work to get rid of those boards or certain directors. That's stewardship. If you're an investor now, you can call up the annual stewardship report of many institutional investors and see how they address questions like this. So they're now much more public. We've got again, a long way to go. We're still at a point where you and I, or ordinary savers, it's hard to find out why and when our financial agents vote on our behalf for or against certain things. It's still a black box. And I'm sure we are going to get to a stage where institutions are going to have to be much more transparent about how they behave.
Are there any kind of surveys or research or, that you could or would reference, or any surveys that are being designed to make the business case for this so that there is a strong business case for greater transparency, greater accountability?
Well, there are two ways to look at that. One is there is a lot of academic research, scholarly research on the relationship between companies, on the one hand, that perform well on ESG parameters, that is to say, environmental, social, and governance parameters, and then how and their performance in terms of stock market performance and yield over time. So it looks as if good ESG relates to good performance over time. That I'm summarizing, a large body of research that is not by any means unanimous, but nonetheless, that's kind of the general picture. So on the one hand, there is a pretty good sense that companies that are better positioned in those areas will do better over time for shareholders. The other business case that is emerging is one that I mentioned a few moments ago, which is that if an investor wants to retain its position in the market, continue to draw capital from rising millennial class investors, then they have to demonstrate their bona fides when it comes to these issues. And,
Yeah.
and that's a business case. If they don't do that, then they're going to lose out. A good, interesting example is Fidelity. Fidelity is a big institutional investor, and again, they used to steer very clear of ESG type issues. But some years ago, they signed the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, the PRI. And frankly, I was surprised. I never thought Fidelity would sign the PRI. And I asked people there, why did they do it? And they said, well, first of all, because if we want to be continuing to be commercially relevant, we have to demonstrate that we have eyesight on these ESG issues. But secondly, they also, and this is again a business case, but not the usual one, if Fidelity wants to be able to hire the best people, and there is a competition for talent, as we know, especially in financial services, but in many cases, if they want to hire the best talent, they have to show that they align with the values of that rising workforce. So they have to demonstrate that they are responsible, and then they're going to get people. State Street Global Advisors, when they went out, they did something interesting, as you'll perhaps be aware, but some years ago, they wanted to draw attention to the fact that they were keen to advocate for diverse boards of directors. And so they commissioned a statue that they put on Wall Street called the Fearless Girl. And, it shows this, we all know it now, this image of this little girl with her hands on her hips facing the bull on Wall Street. And it went viral. That's why we all know Fearless Girl. It went viral. And State Street had to live up to all those expectations. But one of the things that happened that they had not anticipated is suddenly State Street was flooded with job applicants. The reason being, it was no longer a faceless financial bureaucracy that stood for nothing but money making. It now stood for values. And that chimes with the rising workforce. So yes, there are many different dimensions of a business case to undertake this change.
Yeah, no, that's important and critical. And I think if we look at the world of work today and, the war for talent, I think that's strategically, that is a really big issue for many top organizations. How do they win this war for talent?
Yes, exactly.
In your own life, can you share with us a specific example, take us back in time, where you've had a personal ethical and moral dilemma? And what was that situation? How did you feel at the time? And what was your revelation in that moment?
On a professional level, it was that when I came across a sort of a brick wall, as I mentioned earlier in my professional life, and then had to find my way through and heard Jonathan Charkham, and suddenly this kind of vision or sort of epiphany, I guess, came to me that there is a civil economy that I could work with. We could call it the civil economy. And that spins out to all kinds of implications, which, we can talk about, I guess, maybe at a more personal level. I've had in my life the fortune of meeting people who have had to sacrifice in ways that I've been fortunate enough never had to do. I've never had to put my life on the line for something I believed in, and that's not true of my ancestors, my relatives who came to the United States having come out of war in Eastern Europe or pogroms in Eastern Europe. And they came to America to keep us safe, and we were safe, at least so far. And so I haven't had to do that, but I have met people that have really made a choice to put their lives on the line for a cause. And they range from Alexei Navalny. He was at Yale for a while when I was at Yale. And I got to know him. We brought him into the center, made him a fellow, and I've had many conversations with him. And he is an incredibly brave person arguing for change of leadership in Russia and democracy. And when I got to know him, his principal focus was on anti-corruption and shareholder issues. And I asked him, how could you be risking your life like this when you have a wife, you have children, family, your own life? I mean, how do you do? And his view was, well, the more high profile he actually made himself, the more protected he might turn out to be. And now that turned out not to be the case. And of course, I met Mandela when he came to America after his release, and of course knew his story. But to meet people like that, what I learned from that is that there are people who are heroes. And Zelensky is another one, president of Ukraine. They have sacrificed, and they are sacrificing their safety in defense of a cause. But what it has done, when you have leaders that demonstrate courage, and that in cases where they have to sacrifice, they are sacrificing in a courageous manner, it emboldens everyone around them.
Of course.
So leadership, I've seen anyway, does this. It makes heroes out of ordinary people. When you have a Zelensky, when you have a Mandela, when you have a Daria Kaleniuk, or a Alexei Navalny, you can see that it emboldens people. It gives them courage. It makes them bigger than they ever thought they could be to align with a cause. And so I don't, I guess if in areas where I've had the fortune of being in a leadership position, I again have not had to sacrifice anything like what these folks are doing. But to give people a sense of a cause, of a big something beyond themselves, is, I think, critical for making institutions successful and sustainable and responsible over time.
Yeah. You know, that's, by the way, how did you find Alexei Navalny as a person? What struck you most about him?
He had this determination that was unshakable, and this confidence that was unshakable. He knew what the path forward should be, and he was going to pursue it no matter what. It was not something that he was going to be deterred from in any way, even at the cost of his life. He had this sense of a greater cause. And I think this is something that maybe is shared in common with others, such as Mandela, Zelensky. You look at Zelensky's, some of his videos that he's doing almost daily, or sometimes more than daily. And you look in his eyes as best you can through a video, and you see he has accepted his fate. And he knows his fate is on the line, and that he could be shot at any moment by an assassination squad or Russian soldiers, bursting into his offices. So he understands that, and he's still doing it. He's still doing it. I had lengthy conversations back in 1983 with Thabo Mbeki, who, as you know, would later become president of South Africa. But at the time, he was, and this was in Lusaka in Zambia, he was one of the leaders of the ANC in exile. And he put my dissertation, which had been on Umkhonto we Sizwe, the military wing of the ANC. And in 1983, I was doing some further research on that and reporting for a magazine article. he put me in touch with people, and we were together in August, September 1983 in a house in sort of a safe house in Lusaka. And I spent many hours with several of the people who were fighters in Mkatu Sizwe and also with Tabo. And here were people again who understood that at any moment, South African security forces could burst in, or if they were heading back into the country, that they could be exposed and killed. So they understood that when they were making choices, this was not a frivolous thing. They were making a choice where their lives were on the line. And I reflected at the time on how I missed the Vietnam call up because I was just slightly after that. And since then, young Americans like I was at the time, we hadn't been called upon to sacrifice really for anything.
Yeah.
And so to confront people that sacrifice everything, I found it so moving and inspiring. And today, when you see Zelensky doing what he's doing, and you then see the tweets or reporting of ordinary Ukrainians doing extraordinarily courageous things. They're doing what Zelensky's doing. It's leadership like that that can make people into ordinary heroes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to your point, Stephen, there are so many unsung heroes. Talking about Nelson Mandela and, having had your close association with South Africa and meeting many of the leaders that were part of the liberation movement in South Africa. What is your Mandela moment? I know you're a great proponent of Mandela. I know you have remarkable respect and admiration for him and his leadership. Is there a particular moment in time that stands out for you? Take us back. Where were you?
Well, with Mandela personally, first of all, actually, I don't know if you can see, but behind me, I have a framed picture of the front page of the Boston Globe. It says, Mandela and Boston embrace in a day-long celebration of unity. So that's when Mandela came to Boston on the Esplanade and gave this extraordinary speech. And it was...
Was that 1990 when he came on?
Yeah, I believe it was. Yeah. And so that, and actually we have a large photograph of Mandela in our living room in our home. And during COVID, when we had our grandson here, my wife and I had our grandson here, and shortly after he was born, for about a year and a half. And we would teach him, we would say, okay, where's Mandela? And, this little 8-month-old would go, pointing to the
video. Learning young, Stephen.
Oh, yeah, maybe. We're starting the Mandela moments.
Absolutely.
Pretty young. But I guess there are a number of Mandela moments. One of them was certainly in that evening in Lusaka in August, September 1983, talking to people who were followers, of course, of Mandela. They were inspired by Mandela. So to realize that the kind of leadership that Mandela was exercising from prison was powerful. So that was extraordinary. And also to understand that part of leadership in that case is about sacrifice. Zelensky is a similar story, so is Navalny. And we have, I'm Jewish. We have, and I go to Torah study every week, and we started our annual cycle of reading Leviticus. And Leviticus is all about sacrifice. And of course, in a literal sense, nothing that we would do now. It's sacrificing animals for this or that. But stepping back, it is about the power of sacrifice. There's something almost mystically powerful about sacrifice. I have long felt that institutions need to speak out. They need to be part of this conversation, just as they are involved in climate change and believe that to be a systemic risk now to investments. They need to be involved in democracy because the threat to democracy is equally a systemic risk. So we, by we, a few people came together and we were able successfully to hold a virtual sort of summit, which was off the record, but of institutional investors on January 6th, 2022, with the agenda of saying to investors, this is something that you have to speak out on.
Yeah.
And this to me was, I guess, if I had to think about it, it's a Mandela moment because we're trying to bring together very different people, very different stakeholders, and yet bring them around a common purpose that we don't compromise on. And Mandela never compromised on the idea of democracy, but he did compromise in order to bring many people and
Friends and
parties,
foes.
friends and foes together. It was a reconciliation. And now it's a form of justice, but it's not a purity of justice. It's a recognition that there are different interests that need to be addressed, that one needs to be sensitive to without compromising the ultimate goal.
Sure.
And so that's kind of what I had in mind when we brought this group together. And we had
how many were in the group? And when you say it was a diverse group, who were the multiple, stakeholders at the table?
We had many, it was all institutional investors, but from very different walks of life, different sort of business models. And not all were, convinced that this is something that they need to be involved with, but they were there at least to listen. And our job was to give them what they need to take the steps that we think are important. And we're not at the end of that process. We're only at the beginning. We've got more work to do. But it was the first effort to open up the sort of try to open eyes to this moral need that lies ahead of us.
Are these U.S. institutional investors? And when you say we, who are the we that are putting together this?
Yeah, they were not just U.S. institutions. They were also non-U.S. ones with U.S. stakes, large U.S. operations. But they were not just U.S. So it was a large. We had trillions of dollars represented in the room. So very, I think, an impressive group that we got together. The co-sponsors were the Brookings Institution and States United Democracy Center. So those were the two. And so it was nonpartisan. The conveners included Norm Eisen, who was ethics chief at the White House under Obama and also then ambassador to the Czech Republic. Now at Brookings, and former Governor Christy Todd Whitman, who was from the state of New Jersey. Both of them co-chair the States United Democracy Center. So they sort of convened the event. But we had an organizing committee, a small group that put it together.
Yeah, that's remarkable work, Stephen. I mean, we look forward to seeing how that progresses. And as you say, that kind of fits with this new defining role of business and becoming more integrated in society.
I can think about a few other times in my life where it's this cross-fertilization of ideas, the diversity. And people say all the time, diversity leads to better decision making. And I completely not just believe it, but I have seen it so many times. And each of the three moments that I'm thinking of really helped build this field of international corporate governance. But one was in 2000 when I sort of brought together a group under the auspices of the World Bank there was a conference that we held in New Haven, Connecticut. And it was the first conference bringing together people in emerging markets to talk about corporate governance and shareholder issues. And excuse me, it hadn't been addressed before at all, but we brought together people from Brazil, from the Middle East, from Asia, from Europe, the Americas, and the cross fertilization of ideas was so powerful that we could see for years later that it built this international kind of common world of corporate governance and how do you make capital markets accountable. So that was a kind of one. And then if I think about a second time, it was in Prague, where again Norm Eisen happened to be the ambassador.
What year was that? When was that?
Yeah, it was 2011. 2011.
Okay.
Where it was under Brookings. I was a senior fellow at that time, and we sort of, me, Tom Mann, and Norm Ornstein were co-directors of this project called the World Forum on Governance. And and it was an attempt to sort of bring, not just to raise the profile of anti-corruption issues in the capital markets, but to bring capital into it, to bring into the power of capital to bear on anti-corruption. But we brought together, again, cross-fertilization, grassroots anti-corruption organizers in India, in Uganda, in Romania, and Ukraine, and all over the world. And we brought them together. And again, it was a powerful interconnection. It kind of turbocharged work around the world. And so to me, it was enormously rewarding. In fact, there was a terrific person from South Africa who was the public defender at the time, and she came and was very inspiring. And so that kind of work, bringing different people together behind a common cause, is what I would sort of gets me out of bed in the morning.
No, well, that's pretty exciting. I just wondered, in our final few moments, any final thoughts around what is leadership? What is leadership going into the future? And how relevant do you think Mandela is in the future of leadership?
Well, I think Mandela is enormously relevant, because if you sort of break down what it was that brought him to such prominence, not just prominence, but that gave him the power to make change, is that, as I kind of mentioned earlier, first of all, he had the right temperament. He did have a sensitivity. He had an empathy that people could identify with. So I think temperament is very important in leadership. Of course, you do have a sort of a strain of leaders who believe that they get somewhere by bullying, and that may work for a time, but it doesn't ultimately create institutions that are sustainable. So, but the way Mandela's temperament sort of functioned was it was about respect. There was a lot about respect, about understanding, about empathy. And so that, I think, is a critical part of leadership. Second, sort of part of leadership that he exhibited is a sense of strategy. And by strategy, I mean understanding and identifying and communicating a clear objective, which is a big objective, an objective that is beyond the individual, but an objective people could identify with. But at the same time, strategy includes being able to understand that it's not a straight path. It's not a path of purity of any one perspective. It's a path that, in order to get to the end, you have to realize that diversity is a strength, but it's also it's a set of factors that you have to accommodate. You can't just sort of impose one path when you have multiple interests and multiple opinions. So you have to be able to keep an eye on what the ultimate goal is without being pure. You can compromise, you can, within parameters, you have to understand what people need, and try to reconcile your ultimate goal with where they stand. So I think, and then finally having a sort of an understanding of where people are, to be able to communicate, and that's where he was also good, to both in both directions. He was able to listen and also to communicate, even though he was in prison for most of his time. He still had that capacity. Now, beyond all that, there was that turbocharge of sacrifice. Now, not everybody can, in a position where they have to, thank God, put their lives on the line, leadership, but still, you can demonstrate a certain degree of sacrifice. You can, if you're a CEO, you can fly business class, or you can fly coach and talk to people, to demonstrate a certain humility, which I think is critical too. To demonstrate a humility is maybe a form of sacrifice, for some people anyway. So I think, going forward, I think about those characteristics of Mandela, and I see them, as I mentioned, with Zelensky. I see them, with Navalny, with people like Daria Kaleniuk, others too, who really, when they are doing something, they're doing it for a bigger cause. It's not just about themselves.
Yeah. No. Well, Stephen, you yourself have dedicated your life, your work to a much bigger cause. I think tackling this issue of global corporate governance, having standards around the world, and really moving us forward as a corporate sector, and the role we play in the bigger world of good governance and civil well-being, is so valuable and so important. So thank you for sharing those insights. We look forward to catching up again and finding out how some of these initiatives are doing. And thank you for sharing your wisdom with us.
Well, you're very kind. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It's an honor and a great pleasure. So thank you.
Friends, exercising leadership and moral clarity is a risky business, even for those with millions, billions, and managing trillions. Big money and high levels of power are insufficient. Even the richest and the most powerful are not immune from exercising leadership. Talking to my good friend, a money-smart, wise man, Dr. Stephen Davis, a Harvard Law School senior fellow, a 2024 winner of the International Governance Network Lifetime Achiever Award, an advisor to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission Investor Advisory Committee, helps us understand that when we are tackling big moral issues and challenges, that high levels of power and loads of money, millions, billions, and managing trillions are not enough. Wall Street and Main Street, ordinary people like me and you, need to exercise leadership, particularly when we are challenging the status quo and leading in dangerous times. Exercising leadership to stay alive, literally, figuratively, and financially. In a complex social, business, and financial world where I grew up, I used to naively believe and falsely assume that where there is a moral dilemma, a systemic flaw, a regulator's factual view of wrongdoing, that simply following the law, hiring the top legal experts, and doing the right thing would win in court and win the day. I was wrong. Executing professionally, whether that be executing with stamina, with substance, with money, resources, and expertise, is insufficient. Yes, it may be professional. It even may be powerful, and one may invest millions in order to get to a desired outcome. But that is not the same as exercising leadership and challenging the status quo and leading in dangerous times. This harsh realization helped me uncover 5 life-altering truths about exercising leadership and leading in dangerous times to stay alive. Firstly, exercising leadership and moral clarity is a risky business. People get assassinated emotionally, socially, digitally, financially, and physically for challenging the status quo. Secondly, slow is fast and fast is slow. Resist the temptation to jump into action to try and solve the problem before fully diagnosing the true nature of the challenge and the problem that exists. Is it technical, like changing a law, or is it adaptive, like helping legislators and regulators change their values, attitudes, and beliefs about the law and the system? Or is it both, technical and adaptive? The third is that loss is at the heart of the danger, whether it be real or imagined. One needs to detach, to step onto the balcony, to understand the system as a whole, the different stakeholders, their competing agendas, and their real or imagined losses. Number 4, loss goes way beyond money and power. Very often the perceived, real, or imagined losses for different stakeholders is a loss of values, beliefs, attitudes, a loss of certainty, a loss of loyalty towards people and cultures, and perhaps the highest risk and the greatest loss is loss of self. Who are you? What is your identity? What is your planned legacy? The 5th major leadership lesson and truth that I uncovered is the fact that when we are adapting, dealing with an adaptive challenge or a systemic change or a change that is challenging the status quo in some way or another, one needs to go beyond your authority. That authority that gives you the right to direct, protect, and maintain order. You need to exercise leadership, to analyze, energize, and galvanize a large collective group towards a common goal, remembering that history reveals that the power of the people is greater than the people in power. We know that money talks, and big money talks a lot. We understand the power of the purse incentivizes governments and systems to bend and change. But even those with immense power, with considerable money, millions, billions, and even managing trillions, need to exercise leadership in order to meet a moral moment, to stay true to themselves, and to stay alive. So until next time, remember that leading boldly is about making thoughtful, clear choices. And bold leadership is about taking bold action, just one small step at a time, one step for you, but together with your ability to exercise leadership in dangerous times and stay alive, a giant step for humanity. So take care and take thoughtful, bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, sign up on anne-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.